Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo and I am a faculty member at Northwestern University. I'm also the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Dr. Pablo Porten-Cheé is a communication researcher and junior professor of communication studies and information society in Ibero-America at the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies, Heidelberg University in Germany. Mariana Sanchez Santos, a doctoral student at American University and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Pablo in just a minute. I am delighted to know, however, that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and institutions' history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mariana will tell us more about Pablo's research and career in just a minute. Then Pablo will present his work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Mariana will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mariana, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Pablo. Allow me to introduce Professor Pablo Porten-Cheé. He holds a PhD from the University Düsseldorf, where he studied the effects of media content on everyday face-to-face and online conversations. Later, he was a postdoc at Berlin Free University at the Institute for Media and Communication Studies. He was head of the research group Digital Citizenship at the Wiesenbaum Institute for the Network Society at the same university. Since April 2021, he is junior professor of communication studies at Heidelberg University with an emphasis on information societies in Latin America. His main areas of research are three: digital hate speech and disinformation, digital citizenship, and digital media effects. Some of his research projects are political participation and media use of Latin American communities in the US. And recently, well, also congratulations for your new publication on New Media and Society entitled "What Makes a Good Citizen Online? The Emergence of Discursive Citizenship Norms in Social Media Environments." Let me remind you to the audience that please write your questions on the Q&A chat. Welcome, Professor Pablo. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for the kind introduction. The same for Pablo and also for the team around Mora and Valeria. Thank you so much for having me here. Before I start my talk, I would just like to switch to the presenter mode. Again, thank you so much for having me here at the Latinx Digital Media Virtual Seminar Series. And I'm thankful that you provide me the opportunity to present my research to a wider audience that I would like to connect with my research. Yeah, and that said, again, I think the team around Pablo and Mora do an immensely important job to amplify the innovation in our field from scholars in Latin America and those like me studying the context from abroad. And now let me start. My presentation has a long title and aims to provide an overview over my research over the last years, where colleagues and I try to understand and explain today's political participation under digital conditions. Let me guide you through the straightforward structure of this talk. So I will begin with some points of departure. For me, social media use and its challenges and possibilities for how we think about politics and engage in politics is a central point of departure. I will then address some challenges and possibilities and describe some of my research around to explain political participation from novel angles, emphasizing the mindset behind participation, so-called citizenship norms. To be very transparent, I have started to do research on Latin American contexts just by last year. I will therefore showcase mainly work done in Germany and the global north. But building on that work, I will present a recent study on how Latinx in the US form novel citizenship norms that are supposed to surge from digital conditions. Let's start with some points of departure. Coming from political communication, I have been observing the shifts in our daily media use habits, both with fascination and worriness. Without a doubt, social media have expanded the media environment. Among other uses, such as entertainment, they are used to inform about political topics and discuss them with friends and followers. In general, such changes also apply to Latin American context, where using online and social media are the top news sources. Reuters data from the year 2020 found out that 2 out of 3 study participants used, for example, Facebook for news in that period. That counts for Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. Due to social media platforms that serve to gather a variety of topics and voices from principally everyone, the media environment has developed into a high-choice media environment, how Pryor terms it, where information abundance is a constant condition. This condition comes with some consequences, from which I just select a few. First, when there's a lot to look at, our attention shrinks. In his recent book, Abundance, my colleague Pablo refers to psychological research that indicates that, I quote, under normal circumstances, a person can accurately process only 7 plus or minus 2 units of information regarding a given variable at a particular point of time. News consumption has to battle for attention against entertainment. And Pablo has shown that for Argentina, entertainment catches more attention than news does. This, secondly, presents problems for those organizing political change and therefore call for users' attention. Engaging others to join petitions, to join demonstrations, etc., becomes difficult when the next post contains funny cat gifs or memes. Third, under circumstances of dense individual networks on social media, we may learn that one can be informed through social media even when not actively looking for news. Research has shown that this news finds me perception has detrimental effects for participation, such as voting. Finally, not everything is bad. And just to name one positive aspect of using social media, besides their well-known affordances, social media are also spaces where we can, I do not say we do, get in contact with diverse viewpoints. This standpoint is debatable though, since this research field is huge and a short answer is difficult. On social media, we can observe other users' behaviors, observing what works well and what does rather work not so well in terms of opinions and expressions, and guiding one's own behavior by such observations may be termed as indicators of social learning. For example, research has found evidence that new Facebook users shared content because they may have observed other users sharing content previously. Given the amount of information online, I have focused on heuristic indicators of endorsement that also may affect social learning. From this perspective, we have developed the concept of popularity cues that refers to numbers of likes and shares that may indicate a certain degree of endorsement of items on social media. We have found evidence that popularity cues affect personal and perceived public opinion. It is not surprising to say that hate speech, incivility, and mis- or disinformation are some of today's most discussed challenges related to social media platforms, which are presumed to be catalyzers for different forms of virulent communication online. Virulent communication presents a list of problems. First, and to say the least, they harm several dimensions of communication norms, such as to inform or to defend liberal democratic principles when debating. Second, citizens may not get the information they need to exist and engage in a society. Their agency may be limited. Third, hate speech is presumed to provide the ground for real-world violence, as recent evidence indicates. Finally, virulent communication excludes users from the public discourse and limits its capacity to form reasoned and inclusive public opinions. But the users, even under conditions of low information, false friends, popularity cues, and virulent communication, can and do express their agency. They do so when sharing and signing online petitions or expressing their recent boycott of ethically problematic goods. And they don't ignore virulent communication. What we observe is that users counter speech like this example of a Facebook post, which opposes anti-Semitic, anti-hate speech comments. Against such communication phenomena, we have developed the concept of online civic intervention that refers to user reactions that aim to restore an accessible and reasoned public debate online. We consider OCI as a new form of user-based political participation in the digital sphere because it actively influences political outcomes. Led by the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin, we conduct a representative survey on communication and participation in Germany every year since 2019. Based on the last year's data, we can observe that over half of the participants had recent contact with hate speech. But more important, we saw that OCI, online civic intervention, is not a residual phenomenon. About 1 of 3 participants intervened against hate speech, while verbal counter speech has even increased. Against this background, I would now like to introduce you to some conceptual and empirical studies that try to address how social media use affects today's participation of individuals. When studying political participation, the usual suspect is to study a behavior an individual exerts to express or change politics in some form. My research is and was interested in the role of digital media shaping such political behaviors. However, my colleagues at the Weizenbaum Institute for the Networked Society and I were even more sparked by the idea of how digital media changes the way citizens view their role in a society and in a democracy. We found the concept of citizenship norms to be a fruitful ground for our own research on shared expectations of what a good citizen ought to do, which is a definition of citizenship norms under digital conditions. Citizenship norms against this background can serve as a cognitive rationale for taking political action. But first things first, let's start with the participation perspective. Catching attention under high choice conditions, especially on social media, is challenging. We have thus studied how specific content features may spark engagement in political action and applied the framework of narrative persuasion. According to Hinyard and Kreuter, narratives are, I quote, any cohesive and coherent story with an identifiable beginning, middle, and end that provides information about scene, characters, and conflict, raises unanswered questions, or unresolved conflict, and provides finally also a resolution. Narrative persuasion is a media effect supposed to be sparked by narrative communication. The effect is supposed to take place because narratives induce transportation, a concept which refers to the emotional and cognitive engagement with the characters in a narrative. This helps to decrease the suspicion of being actually persuaded by a message. Finally, narratives have been shown to promote narrative consistent beliefs and behaviors in strategic communication. And we build on this work. So what we did is to conduct a study to find out how narratives affect political participation in the digital environment. In particular, we tested the effect of narratives in online petition texts on the intention to sign the petitions. We ran experiments, web-based ones, in a comparative design in Germany and in Australia, and created experimental conditions on two issues, climate change and social welfare. I will now show you some of the experimental material we have used and what key characteristics the narrative had. For the petition text with a narrative, we presented personal stories about fictitious humans that had experienced harm. Here, the case of climate change. One feature is personalization, which tried to emphasize a first-person narrator. In this case, Agnes Wilson. She's highlighted here, and I'm just indicating the appearances of her being a first-person narrator in the text. The narrative is supposed to apply means of emotionalization as well. In this case, the narrator described how her health issue caused a matter of emergency. I just felt really dizzy and had a hard time breathing, etc. Finally, another feature of the narrative was to describe a problem or conflict around that character. In this case, health issues of elder persons related to high temperatures, which I marked here. The doctor reports we have had an increase in these types, this health issues, of cases lately. The elderly are particularly susceptible to this complication when temperatures are this high. We found that the online petitions applying narratives sparked a higher intention to sign the petition than the non-narrative petitions. The effect was found across issues and countries and was mediated by transportation, the cognitive and emotional involvement with the narrative's characters. But now let's switch perspectives. Let's move on with a possible concept behind political participation, the citizenship norms. There's a duality of norms tradition that dominates in political communication. On the one hand side, dutiful citizenship norms comprising expectations about individuals' actions that contribute to public obedience. The other hand side, self-actualizing citizenship norms that emphasize an individual's, I quote, willingness to act on his or her principles, be politically independent, and address social needs, as Dalton refers to. They both share the problem that they have disregarded how new experiences with online or social media has shaped the expectations on the citizen's role. That's how we argue. In consequence, newer concepts have emerged, but have rarely left the conceptual stage. We argue that only qualitative research is able to inquire the formation of citizenship norms based on everyday practices and underlying ideals. This was the starting point for our qualitative study. We conducted the study with young social media users in Germany, trying to answer the following research question. What citizenship norms do people express, and how are they related to experiences in social media environments? Conducted 25 interviews and 3 focus groups in the year 2018. What we found can be divided into experiences in social media environments and implicitly related norms and practices. Participants reported positive and negative experiences in social media environments. Positive experiences were, for example, the possibility to open up wider discourses and easily engaging with a variety of viewpoints on social media. This impression shaped the 2 norms. First, participants appreciated to share information with peers, but also to take care about the quality of such information. We called this first norm dimension considered contribution. Negative experiences sparked 2 other dimensions of norms. Users perceived the social media environment as polluted in different aspects. Typically, this was related to clickbait content from dubious sources. We associated this experience with a normative appreciation to thoughtfully select and not just to consume information. We called this norm dimension individual information care. Finally, users perceived also the discussions to lack of constructiveness and politeness. This experience was linked with support for a norm dimension we called discourse care, which expressed in corrective actions, such as flagging or reporting uncivil comments. Finally, we grouped these 3 dimensions into a definition of what we call discursive citizenship norms, which reads, shared understandings of how citizens ought to participate in the public discourse shaped by social media. After this insights on the concept of discursive citizenship norms, I would like to introduce you to the last part of the presentation. I would like to present a study that builds on this concept of discursive citizenship norms, aiming to find out factors of their formation among Latinx in the US. This study started with 2 ideas or questions. Is the concept applicable to other contexts? And which factors form it? Thus, we studied the formation of discursive citizenship norms among Latinx in the US. We think that this population is particularly interesting because they show a considerable exposure to social media, which is supposed to spark such norms, at least when following our arguments. And Latinx have shown to support other, in this case, expressive citizenship norms, a concept introduced by Daniel Lane, similar as other ethnic groups in the US. This project was conducted with Alcides Velasquez and Ashley Muddyman from the University of Kansas, and we are about to submit a full paper for journal peer review. As data on media use was available to us, we were interested about how crossover news media repertoires formed discursive citizenship norms. The notion of news media repertoire is understood as all the news media that an individual uses with more relative frequency. We argue that cross-platform news media repertoires can unfold a communication mediation process that leads to an outcome of democratic relevance, both directly, respectively, indirectly, and recent. As Spanish language media seem to underrepresent some important topics for Latinx, such as health or education, Latinx may be particularly interested in an amplier cross-platform news media repertoires. Research shows that such repertoires promote exposure to a variety of sources and political participation. Against this background, we argue that crossover news media repertoires increase the personal incentive to share diverse news and increase contact with news of diverse quality. Thus, this crossover news media repertoires may offer a higher chance to learn to distinguish different levels of news quality. Thus, we assumed that crossover news media repertoires would promote discursive citizenship norms on the individual level. Led by Alcides and Ashley, we ran a survey with about 300 participants, self-identified Latinx in the US. Besides that, it is important to know that the context of the survey was November 2020, just after the US presidential election. We've also included two intervening factors: social media political discussion as mediator and perception of negative news on in-group, which serves as moderator. Let's have a short look at how we measured the two norms. We included two norms. First, the considered contribution norms. As we had no empirical example how to measure it, at the Weizmann Institute, we were working on a set of items that we had already introduced in our survey, data that is not published yet. However, we tried our best to translate these German items into English and to graph the full picture of the discursive citizenship norms. So here, for the case of considered contribution norm, the items read: sharing knowledge about politics with others and sharing news items you consider important with others. And the second dimension of discursive citizenship norms included items of individual information care. Here, the items read: informing oneself using trustworthy sources, checking the news sources, informing oneself using different sources. You may have noticed that the M, the mean value of this composite variable of individual information care, is higher for individual information care than for considered contribution. This indicates that among this not representative study for Latinx in the US, there is a small tendency towards the support of this individual information care norm. So we have tested several models, several effects, as you can see here. But first, let me show you two direct effects. We found evidence that the wider the cross-platform news media repertoires were, the more our Latinx participants supported both the considered contribution norm and the individual information care norm. We could support our assumptions of direct effects. Second, we found that social media political discussion significantly mediated the positive effect we previously found. However, only for the considered contribution norm. This effect indicates that social media political discussion may serve as a way to process the assumed value of diversity that may incentivize sharing considered content. Third, we found that the direct effects of cross-platform news media repertoires were not equal for everyone. Those who perceived negative news about the in-group were less supportive for both norms. That's what this minus indicates. Now, let me conclude this presentation. The study allowed us to find evidence that news media use forms discursive citizenship norms, and that social media political discussion additionally fuels the norm formation by presumably allowing interpersonal reason-making. However, perceiving negative coverage on the in-group hinders the democratic appreciation of contributing and well-informing among Latinx. My research on understanding new forms of political participation under digital conditions is far from being conclusive, and my curiosity on the Latin American context has just begun. As next step, I'm planning a larger comparative project that aims to test the effects of discursive citizenship norms on OCI, online civic intervention, in Colombia and in Germany. I'm convinced that political communication has to strongly include Latin American context, as they provide, for example, different grounds of media socialization and media trust that may play in our models. Thus, my research shall contribute to developing a stronger context-sensitive political communication research. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I'm very excited to engage into the discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pablo. This was a great presentation, and I am looking forward for the conversation. Also, I want to remind the audience that you can post all your questions here in the Q&A. Actually, my question is a little bit going like at the end of what you are, what you mentioned at the end of the presentation. And how do you think, or what is your hypothesis of how discursive citizenship norms can be observed in countries of Latin America? And bueno, yeah, and let me add, what do you think that, or which effects can we see from different countries in Latin America? Because obviously, as you know, it's not the same thing to observe Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela. So I don't know, what is your hypothesis on that?
Thanks a lot for your question, Mariana. I just have suspicions, and they are supported with weak arguments, but I will try my best to address your question. So taking the example of Mexico, where the contact with mis and disinformation is assumed to be quite high, and the fear to get, let's say, infected by fake news is also quite high. And at the same time, the trust in institutions is quite high as well. I kind of assume that, for example, Mexico would be a good ground to study the agency of users acting as citizens online because of a lack of strong institutions that are able to regulate fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. That as one example. I think even Mariana, you are from Mexico and can correct my suspicions.
No, I agree. So far, so far, so good.
Yeah, that is one best guess I had. So Mexico for me is also a ground where I would be curious to study discursive citizenship norms and how they are, let's say, how they resonate among the population, and which differences there are in their support there and the support in, let's say, the global north.
Thank you. Now we have a question from the audience. This is from Celeste Wagner. Thank you so much, Professor Porten-Cheé, for your presentation. I would love to know more about your expectations in your future study comparing Colombia and Germany. What do you think might be different or similar in this research when looking at a comparison between a European context and a Latin American one? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, excellent question. The idea of also studying Colombia and Germany is also led by giving a bit more weight to the issue context and also make a bit of a comparison possible. Sometimes when we conduct comparative designs, we kind of struggle, and I will struggle for sure, we struggle with creating comparative conditions of an issue. So let's take the example of social welfare, where I did once an experiment across Germany and South Korea. You can imagine that this topic was discussed quite differently. The same will hold true for almost all designs, at least as I can imagine, when they begin to be comparative. So there are, of course, differences between the two countries, but there is one interesting match, at least I see an interesting match between this Western, or let's say global North country and this global South country, is the topic of migration. So when I'm interested about OCI, reacting to hate speech and incivility and so on. I'm curious about how users react to hate speech, for example, against migrants, groups of vulnerable groups, immigrants, refugees, for example. Now, when it comes to comparability, Germany has a year-long tradition in the last years of migration. So millions of people from Syria, for example, came. Now, a lot of people from Ukraine are migrating to Germany. They are fleeing, they're not migrating, I'm sorry. And the same or similar mechanism holds true for Colombia in relation to Venezuela, where a lot of Venezuelans had to flee in the last couple of years. I don't say that the attitude towards the citizens that are coming from another country are similar, but I think that the degree of controversiality of this topic of migration could be similarly high in both countries and may serve to better compare and make the issue of migration better comparable across such different countries that, of course, differ in media socialization, media use, diffusion of digital media, but also trust in institutions, trust in media, and so on. So this is one point I'm thinking about why Colombia and Germany may fit quite well. The other point is more concerning differences between two countries. So my idea is not only to study the reactions, the civic reaction, to say so, of users online, but also to see whether they react to hate speech that is directed towards social groups that we in democracies are supposed to protect. So in this case, journalists. So in countries where press freedom is perceived as rather weak, as for example, in Colombia, and in countries where press freedom is supposed to be a bit of a higher good, I assume that OCI and this civic intervention online may be guided by different factors, or maybe by the same factors, but to a certain different degree. So that makes, I think, Colombia and Germany an appropriate selection to study how users engage online. I hope this answered at least parts of your question, dear Celeste, and if you have another one, just go for it. And I'm happy to hear such.
We now have a question from Mora.
Thank you very much, Professor Pablo, for this really interesting presentation. I have a question that is rather conceptual or theoretical. I'm really curious and interested about your selection, your decision to focus, at least on one of your studies, on the idea of discursive norms, right? How people understand that they should behave in that, and how they understand what a good citizenship would look like, instead of looking at action itself or behavior, right? And my question is why? I can think of some reasons. For instance, I'm thinking that knowing, for instance, what people understand a good citizenship online should be is helpful for understanding why they feel that certain social media platforms are toxic for democracy, for instance, which is a conversation that is rather contemporary today, right? Many governments and citizens are saying that social media are polluting or intoxicating democracies. And I guess that we can know that because we look at how people feel that a good citizenship should look like, and they feel that that's not being, done correctly. So, but again, that's just one idea. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on why we should study how people think normatively about online citizenship, and not so much or as a complement to thinking about action itself. Thank you very much.
Excellent question. First of all, one, I have to think longer, but I have to answer quickly. So my answer goes like this. I would not recommend to choose either side, but both sides are important to have on the, let's say, practice side, and not only an observable picture of what users click or donate or sign petition or share petition, but also to better understand which ideals are guiding this practice on an everyday use. So there is kind of an intersection of of our approach when studying the norms. I don't say that we only looked into the minds of the citizens. We did a back and forth inductive play. So what we wanted to find out in this qualitative interviews that I didn't conduct, but colleagues of me conducted. So I'm not the one who can provide you with this snippets of interviews. But what we did is to let them tell us what their daily practices were. You could say situations of political participation, but at the same time, always letting them reflect in how that reflected their ideals of how to behave online. So from a conceptual point of view, our study, I guess, could be framed also as a, let's say, more practice-oriented or participation or behavioralist-oriented manner. But our interview guide, or let's say our interviews were guided by the idea to, at the end, crystallize more what were the ideals behind of it and what were the expectations when exerting certain behaviors online, and also how the individuals observed others. So this is kind of the point of social learning, how the others were observed, and whether instances where one could say this behavior merits maybe kind of an mimicking, or is something that I would rather debate and criticize based on my values. And all of this brought together, reflecting how the practices reflected the values, brought us to develop what we call norms that are rather on the injunctive side. So norms of what we ought to do, or what the participants implicitly told us what they ought do when acting online, but not something that they said, this is an explicit norm that we are telling you, that coincidentally were expressed by 50 interview participants. So this was a theoretical abstraction that we at the end did. I hope this kind of addressed your answer.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Pablo.
I think now we have a question from Val. Are you there? You can unmute.
Thank you. For some reason, I'm not able to share my video, but I can ask the question nevertheless. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation, Professor Pablo. I'm really interested in the concept you introduced at the beginning of the presentation regarding the tendency of social media users to observe and imitate other users' behaviors, as well as their reactions to those behaviors online. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the larger impact of these tendencies on the 3 discursive citizenship norms linked to positive and negative experiences on these platforms. Thank you so much.
I have to add something to the paper that we just published in Social Media and Society, because this social learning perspective was something that throughout the revision process, we carved out, because we had to decide which road to take, and this kind of didn't fit to the narrative anymore. But I'm still convinced, and I would do this link now in order also to address your question. So what I'm convinced about is that users do not only learn from the explicit utterances and behaviors they can observe from other users via comments, so via texts, but they also do it by aggregated user representations, because in many cases on social media, they have little to no information about the co-audience, but they often have information about the co-audience in an aggregated way that we have translated into the concept of popularity cues, which are aggregated user representations. So I think that, for example, utterances that oppose a certain political direction, or let's take the example of hate speech. Let's take a hate speech that is anti-Semitic, as I previously showed. If this comment is supported by 1,000 likes, this is something different than when it's not supported by any likes or even disliked, at least from the social learning perspective. It may seem, I have to correct, it can seem acceptable to utter such comments when such comment gets 1,000 likes. And this may spark imitators that may say, okay, this may be a controversial take, which is not a take at all, but it drives attention and may spill in some new followers into my Twitter or Facebook account. So I don't say that social learning is normatively good here, but it may be a mechanism to understand why users may still opt for communicating hate speech, because they may mimic and imitate others' behaviors. They may receive a lot of, let's say, quasi-endorsement by invisible audiences otherwise.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question from Celeste. She says, thank you for your answer. Also, if there's a time for a second question, do you think that in emotionalization conditions, it might make a difference who is the person sharing their experience? In your example, I believe it was a female senior adult. Would you expect different effects when it comes to other demographics?
That's also an excellent question. And the theory of narrative persuasion assumes that one of the reasons why we get convinced and can dive into the life worlds of those described by the narrative is because we identify with the characters that are in the narrative. So it's difficult for me as a 40-year-old German to identify with a 78-year-old woman in Australia, or let's say so in Germany, to keep it constant. Of course. So you could assume that there are limiting forces when it comes to this. So in an ideal setting, you would receive narratives, including characters that you can identify with best in terms of demographic standards, because these are the indicators that you can see or read first the best, I would say. So yes, from that perspective, you could assume that the effects of the narratives could have been even higher if there would be kind of an optimization in terms of matching demographics of characters and receivers of the narrative texts.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. And we have a final question from Professor Pablo.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Pablo, for a great presentation. I have a question. You talked before about differences across countries in Latin America. So I want to take the spirit of that question into intra-country differences. The Latino, Latina, Latinx community in the US is very diverse, very heterogeneous. So I wonder if you could comment on the results of your study there, about whether you found any differences within the Latinx people who were part of the study, and whether in general this was something that was considered as part of the research design or perhaps for a follow-up study. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Pablo, for your question. It's yeah, I have to admit that the sample size was so small that we could not run intra differences or intergroup differences. so it's just kind of an suspicion that I could express how these differences could look like. So to think about differences, you may think about which dimensions to take to differ between what. So you could take other countries, first, second, third generation. You could think about education. So you would take some kind of an additional demographic here. What we know from previous research is that the least educated profit the most from cross-platform news repertoires. So thinking like in that direction, if we would split our sample in two groups, one of being highest educated and a bit lower educated group, you could assume differences here without taking into consideration, of course, other demographics. But yes, I assume that when you strongly consider the moderation role of education as a variable, you could think that crossover news repertoires may have an even stronger effect on forming discursive citizenship norms among the low educated.
Thank you, Pablo. We have another question in the Q&A. Mariana is going to proceed to say what that is.
Thank you. Yeah, we have one last question I think we can take from the audience. Vivian Clement says, I am curious about how transnational citizens participate politically in their home nation via social media. Have you taken into account how this particular group complicates, enhances citizenship participation online, what their action could look like, and how it parallels a space-based citizenship practices, citizens living in that nation versus non-space-based citizenship, which are citizens living abroad? Essentially, how does distance affect participation online? Thank you.
So that's an excellent question. I learned so much just from the questions. And I have no answer to it, like to say, yeah, that's the answer, but I have also a best guess here. So one of our arguments to say that Latinx may be quite prone to such crossover news media repertoires was the empirical finding by a colleague of us that Spanish language media may underrepresent topics that are of special attention or interest of the Latinx in the US. So this Spanish language media may of course be produced in the US, of course, but it may also be produced in Venezuela or in Colombia or in Peru or whatever. So now comes this part which it gets interesting. So this transnational perspective. So where citizens in the US having a Latinx background consume media from abroad, from their home countries, may kind of lose a bit or don't have this close tie with the social and media reality in the US. And the information that is needed to have clear as a citizen in the US, what is relevant for me to survive, to find a job, to get a good education, to go to college, and so on. It may be interesting for much other reasons, for example, for relationship building, for keeping close ties, for don't losing cultural identity. But a lot of daily questions that I just mentioned may not be answered maybe by the diasporic media, to call them like that. So it can be troubling relying on the home country's media. So that presents for those citizens that live abroad even more pressure, maybe, to opt for a wider, a more diverse menu of views to live, to get a job, to stay healthy, and so on. And at the end, to form democratic considerations such as discursive citizenship norms.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Thank you for a great seminar. Thank you so much, Mariana, for always wonderful moderation. Seminar was super, super interesting, and I'm delighted to see you moving in so many interesting directions. I want to thank our audience for staying with us through the end, and invite everybody to join us next week for the new installment of the virtual seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Goodbye, and thanks again, Pablo.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Mora, Val, Mariana, great team, and all the best for your future seminars.